Episode 33, Executive Protection, Budgeting and Value Communication. A Fortune 500 perspective. From cost center to strategic risk function. Welcome to Executive Protection Insights. I'm Liam. Today's episode is for anyone sitting in a very specific seat, the Executive Protection Director, Global Security Leader, or Senior Decision Maker inside a large Fortune 500 company. If that's you, then you already know something most people outside this role don't fully appreciate. Your job is not just protecting executives. Your job is explaining protection clearly, calmly, and credibly to people who have never worked a protection detail, never stood a post, and never had to make a split-second decision under pressure, but who absolutely control the budget, the governance framework, and the long-term future of your program. And that conversation is rarely simple. Because in a Fortune 500 environment, executive protection is constantly examined through a very particular lens, one shaped by finance, legal exposure, enterprise risk, shareholder expectations, and corporate governance. So today we're going to talk about executive protection budgeting and value communication from the inside of the enterprise. Not from theory, not from tactics, but from the reality of explaining, defending, and sustaining an EP program at scale. The reality of executive protection inside a Fortune 500 company. Let's start by being honest about the environment we operate in. In a Fortune 500 company, executive protection is rarely questioned because of a single event. It's questioned because of consistency, scale, and precedent. Leadership doesn't just ask whether protection is needed. They ask why it's needed this way. They ask why one executive has coverage and another doesn't. They ask why costs differ by region. They ask why this program still exists 5, 10, 15 years later. And those are reasonable questions. In large organizations, nothing survives purely on tradition. Everything must be explainable, defensible, and repeatable, which means executive protection can't rely on informal logic or legacy decisions. It has to stand up to enterprise scrutiny. Why executive protection is still viewed as a cost? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Inside most Fortune 500 companies, executive protection is still viewed primarily as a cost, not a value driver. Not because leadership doesn't care about safety, but because protection doesn't produce visible outcomes. When EP does its job well, nothing happens. There's no incident to point to. No headline avoided that can be quantified, no revenue directly generated. And in an environment where every function is expected to justify its existence, that creates friction. From a corporate perspective, EP can look like a program that quietly grows, rarely changes, and only becomes visible when budgets tighten. That perception, fair or not, is what EP directors are up against. What Fortune 500 leadership actually worries about. To communicate value effectively, EP leaders have to stop focusing on what we do and start focusing on what the company risks. Because the real cost of executive protection failure isn't operational, it's enterprise-wide. A serious incident involving a senior executive doesn't just affect one individual, it triggers legal reviews, regulatory questions, board involvement, media scrutiny, and shareholder concern. It can disrupt earnings calls, delay strategic initiatives, freeze negotiations, damage trust, internally and externally. From a Fortune 500 perspective, executive protection isn't about personal safety. It's about organizational stability. That's the frame that resonates. Speaking the language of the enterprise. One of the biggest mistakes EP leaders make in large organizations is speaking in tactical language to strategic audiences. Formations, rotes, countermeasures. These things matter operationally, but they don't translate well to executives, finance, or legal teams. What does translate is risk. Enterprise leaders think in terms of duty of care, business continuity, legal exposure, governance, predictability. When EP is framed as a tactical function, it feels optional. When it's framed as leadership risk management, it becomes part of the enterprise conversation. Reframing EP as leadership continuity. One of the most effective shifts an executive protection director can make is reframing the mission entirely. Executive protection is not about protecting people because they're important. It's about protecting decision makers because the organization depends on them. Executives carry institutional knowledge, authority, and momentum. Their sudden absence, even temporarily, can stall initiatives, delay decisions, and introduce uncertainty at the highest levels. From a Fortune 500 perspective, EP protects decision velocity, strategic continuity, corporate confidence. That's not a tactical benefit. That's a business one. Demonstrating ROI without an incident. Here's the challenge every EP director faces. You can't wait for an incident to prove your value. So instead of dramatic outcomes, ROI must be demonstrated through stability and control. Things like fewer last-minute disruptions, more predictable travel, faster responses to changes, standardized protection models across regions, clear documentation of decisions. These indicators tell leadership something important. This program is managed, not improvised. And in large organizations, maturity is value. Budgeting in a Fortune 500 environment. In enterprise environments, budgets are not just financial tools. They are governance documents. A strong EP budget doesn't just ask for money, it explains what assumptions are being made, what drives cost, what is essential versus scalable, what trade-offs exist. Leadership doesn't expect certainty, they expect transparency. When EP budgets are clear and honest, trust increases. When they're opaque or defensive, scrutiny follows. Why education must be ongoing. One of the most common failures in EP budgeting happens long before numbers are submitted. It happens when leadership only hears about executive protection once a year, during budget review. In Fortune 500 companies, education must be continuous. Stakeholders should understand how risk is assessed, why coverage changes, and what drives decisions. When leaders understand the logic, budget conversations stop being confrontational and start being collaborative. Metrics that actually matter. Enterprise leaders don't need more data. They need the right data. Metrics that matter at this level include consistency across regions, reduction in reactive decisions, improved audit readiness, predictable execution, clear standards. These metrics show maturity, governance, and control, which is exactly what large organizations value. Technology and credibility. In large companies, technology isn't just about efficiency, it's about credibility. Centralized systems allow EP leaders to show structure, consistency, and accountability. They allow leaders to explain decisions clearly, document processes, and demonstrate professionalism at scale. And that matters, especially when budgets are reviewed by people far removed from day-to-day operations. Common mistakes EP directors make. Some mistakes show up repeatedly at the enterprise level. Over-explaining tactics instead of explaining risk. Only defending the program when challenged. Applying inconsistent rules without explanation. Using fear instead of logic. Enterprise leadership doesn't respond well to alarm. They respond to reason. Lessons for executive protection directors. So here's the takeaway from one Fortune 500 EP leader to another. Executive protection is enterprise risk management. Budgets are communication tools. ROI is about stability, not incidents. Education is ongoing. Transparency builds trust. When EP directors master value communication, protection stops being questioned and starts being understood. Closing thoughts. In Fortune 500 companies, executive protection will always be examined. That scrutiny isn't a weakness. It's a sign that the organization takes governance seriously. When EP leaders communicate clearly, consistently, and in enterprise language, protection becomes embedded, not defended. Platforms like Advanced Work help large organizations professionalize EP planning, standardize operations, and communicate value clearly across the enterprise. Thanks for joining me on Executive Protection Insights. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay prepared, and remember, in the enterprise, protection that is understood is protection that lasts.